All right, muscle, the breakdown. Again, this is inspired by this graph that I found in Cram's Introduction to Electromyography. Muscle tissue has two mechanical components. One is the contractile apparatus, and the other is the connective tissue. The contractile tissue will change length very much like this, like Velcro, right? So depending on how it's overlapped, I've got that length of the tissue, or I can shorten it by doing that, right? Okay, so it's shorter there. Whereas the connective tissue component, or the elastic component, changes length like this, right? It unfurls, okay? So when we think of a muscle changing length, lengthening, it is a combination of that adjustment, like the Velcro, right? And the unfurling from the connective tissue that allows us to achieve that dynamic range of motion. Now, our question is, how much of that change in length is coming from the unfurling, and how much of that change in length is coming from the changes in the relationship between these cross-bridging elements? Okay, so first let's take a look at this tissue with no active tension. No active tension, okay? So it's completely relaxed, it's beyond relaxed. So we're gonna fix it to one end of a board, let's say, and we're gonna grab onto the other end, we're gonna start to pull on it. And we're gonna measure how much tension it gives us, how much resistance it gives us, just passively, okay? And what we'll notice is that we don't start to get any kind of resistance until we get to about 100% of the resting length. And then as we move past that, get past 150%, as we move out towards 200%, there's a sharp increase in the amount of resistance that this tissue gives us. So we could say that between here and say there, there's actually a lot of this going on, right? And then somewhere up here, it becomes like this, and there's a whole lot of resistance to the tug. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And now we want to look at what happens when we add the contractile apparatus to the elastic component, right? So no more just passive lengthening. We're going to be looking at what happens when we have this muscle actively contract. So we add an alpha motor neuron that tells the muscle to contract, and it can shorten to about 50% of its resting length, okay? Here, now I'm going to start to pull on that muscle again. I'm going to see how much tension can it generate right there. Well, it's pretty good, but as we start to lengthen the tissue, we see that the amount of force that it can produce increases. In other words, the amount of resistance that it's offering us increases up to about 100% of the length of the tissue. So somewhere in there we get this optimal cross-bridging relationship, right? This kind of Velcro overlap thing. But then somewhere past that, it starts to drop off, and then it increases again. So what happens between here and here to allow for that decrease and increase? Well, somewhere past here, we no longer have that optimal cross bridging. Instead of looking like this, it's gonna look more like that, right? Less cross bridging, therefore less force. But as we start to pull on that more, as we start to lengthen the tissue more, guess what starts to take over? These passive elastic components. So what does this have to do with stretching? Well, typically when we're stretching, we are trying to increase the length of some tissue, right? And if there's a limit in that length, we want to shove on it and get a little bit more range out of it. Well, here's what I'm suggesting, is that if you don't have that tissue at close to 150% of its resting length, then probably that tension that you're feeling is coming from the contractile apparatus. And therefore, we should be negotiating with the nervous system to get the contractile apparatus to back off, and that will give us more lengthening of the tissue. All right, so the question becomes, how do you negotiate with the nervous system? Well, there are two, I'll say, big areas that you can look into. One, I'll call it mindfulness. Using things like biofeedback or subjective reports and techniques for teaching people how to use their minds to control their bodies. That will affect this, this contractile apparatus and allow for more motion. The other way to go would be to use exercise, specific exercise design. In particular, taking advantage of a phenomenon called post-activation potentiation. And there are a few strategies to do that. Some involve using maximal effort, some involve using minimal effort, some involve using contractions that last 5 seconds. Others involve contractions lasting for closer to 2 minutes. So depending on your goal, you got a lot of options to negotiate with this nervous system to get more motion if that's what you're looking for. And if more motion also means more relaxation, hey, that whole mindfulness thing is huge. Rubber bands stretch. Muscles don't. Now, I'm not saying stop stretching people. That's not what I'm saying at all. You guys are professionals. You're going to do what you want to do. I just think that we have another way of thinking about when we would choose to stretch people and what that goal should be or could be, okay, based on this information.